You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
I'm Jason Palmer, one of the hosts of The Intelligence, The Economist's daily current affairs podcast. The Economist's award-winning shows make sense of what matters, from our special series on China's president to our weekly podcasts on business, technology, and American politics. Our journalists provide fair, in-depth reporting on the events shaping the world. To get the annual plan for less than $2.50 per month, search for Economist Podcasts Plus to start listening today.
My brother-in-law died suddenly, and now my sister and her kids have to sell their home. That's why I told my husband we could not put off getting life insurance any longer. An agent offered us a 10-year, $500,000 policy for nearly $50 a month. Then we called SelectQuote. SelectQuote found us identical coverage for only $19 a month, a savings of $369 a year.
Whether you need a $500,000 policy or a $5 million policy, SelectQuote could save you more than 50% on term life insurance.
For your free quote, go to SelectQuote.com. SelectQuote.com. That's SelectQuote.com.
SelectQuote. We shop. You save. Full details on example policies at SelectQuote.com/commercials.
Hey, just a quick note before the interview starts. During the interview, the book A Canned Loan Officer, which is being reprinted by the Vickers Machine Gun Collection and Research Association, is mentioned. That book is actually available for pre-order on the day that this episode releases. I had a chance to give the book a read before we did the interview, and I thought it was an interesting first-hand account of a soldier's experiences during the war. You can find a link to the pre-order site in the show notes. Hello everyone and welcome to another History of the Second World War interview. Today I'm joined by Rich Fisher, a director of the Vickers MG Collection and Research Association. Rich, how's it going today?
Good, thanks. Nice to meet you, Wesley.
It's nice to meet you as well. So we're going to start off with a kind of an easy question, hopefully, as a director. What is the Vickers MG Collection and Research Association?
So we're a not-for-profit association here in the UK where basically we study the Vickers MG, but everything connected to it. So the Vickers served for the British Army from 1912 to 1968, so a long period of time. It gives us an opportunity to study the Great War, the Second World War, Korea, British intervention in Malaya, loads of stuff around that. But also it's served around the world. So the Vickers Armstrongs, as they became, they were the dominant arms company of certainly the 1920s and 30s, and they sold the Vickers everywhere that would buy them, which was most countries. So we've got research sort of strains into South American countries, the Far East. They were built by several different countries around the world as well. So the US built Vickers machine guns. Not a lot of people know that. Australia did. Portugal even. So we've got loads of different strands that we just study the Vickers from. Now, I'm a director of the association. There are four of us, but the collection side of things is built from a collection that I spent. I think it's about 15 years. So I've been collecting. I bought my first Vickers machine gun when I was 12 years old. So those that know, in the United Kingdom, that is.
Was there any permitting problems with that or anything?
No, not at the time. So that was a deactivated Vickers, or a DWAT in US terms. We now have firing guns, which is probably something that most people would think here in the UK we don't have. So that's it's not unique, but it's quite scarce to have firing machine guns in the UK. But so I had the opportunity when I was 12 to buy one. My grandfather had been a Vickers machine gunner in the Second World War, so that's what got me into it. I spent then 15 years collecting anything that I could to do with the Vickers, and for various reasons, in 2011, I decided that the collection was quite extensive, and I wanted to professionalize what I was doing, safeguard that as well. for personal, financial reasons, all of that sort of stuff. I wanted to make sure that this collection that I'd spent so long putting together didn't get broken up. So I formed this not-for-profit, the Vickers MG Collection and Research Association, which has now been in existence for just over 10 years, and does a variety of things. And we'll talk about some of those different projects through the course of this, I'm sure. But we go from open days, people visiting us here in Swindon, which is in Wiltshire, in the middle of the UK, to going out and doing some living history work, to producing a YouTube channel, lots of archive material online, manuals relating to the Vickers, lots of other material that we do as well, writing academic papers, publishing books, lots and lots of stuff. But at the heart of it is the Vickers machine gun, because it interests me, really. Comes down to what particularly pulls my strings, and that is the Vickers machine gun.
That's where all good sort of history projects start. Is, I don't know, what do you want to learn about?
Absolutely, yeah.
I think I am contractually obligated to start off this interview after that introduction with a question about the Vickers. So one of the things I find really fascinating about the Vickers, just kind of in general, is how so much of the history of the First World War and into the Second World War and the years in between and then the years immediately after is kind of gets wrapped around like conversations of technology and how technology shifted during these conflicts and how that ended up kind of changing the nature of warfare. But then you have pieces of military hardware like the Vickers. There are some other examples as well that are there for this whole time period, right? You know, the Vickers is there in 1912, I believe you mentioned, before the First World War. And then it's, there are jets flying over Vickers by the time it is retired. So what kind of allowed the Vickers MG to kind of exist in all these different time periods?
Yeah, like I said, it's 1912 to 1968 with the British alone. Yeah, but then the South Africans continued to use that until the 1980s. So, it's one of those bits of kit, a bit like the Browning .5 or the Browning 50. It's still there in service today. It's a 1921 design at the heart of it. Some of these things just get the best they can be and can't get improved. I'm sure we'll hit that at some point with other technology as well. But it's one of those bits of equipment that really doesn't get matched. Even in the 1960s, it goes out of service because we change what we need. It's not because the gun becomes obsolete from a technology perspective, because there's nothing that replaces it. It's because we don't need water-cooled machine gunnery anymore, because we've got sustained fire from mortars, from light artillery, from things like that. So it's because we don't need the same level of automatic firepower. But what makes the Vickers longevity be so great is because actually so many things change around it. So although we think of the gun as remarkably unchanged, and it is, it's the Mark I Vickers machine gun that gets introduced in 1912, and it's the Mark I Vickers machine gun that gets taken out of service in 1968. There are several other marks, but they're for like aircraft, which go in and go out of service. They're not needed. There are tank guns as well that aren't needed because tanks get different machine guns, and effectively the Browning replaces those. But for the infantry gun, it's the Mark I that goes in and out of service, and it's because it's an entirely flexible thing. Once it goes down to that small scale, you can change the organisation, and the organisation changes a lot around the Vickers. At one point, you've got 2 guns per infantry battalion. Then you've got 4. Then you've got them brigaded into machine gun companies as part of the Machine Gun Corps in the First World War. Then you've got them turned into machine gun battalions with 64 Vickers working together. And then at the end of the war, they get returned to the infantry battalions and the cavalry regiments. They have them as well. And then as we hit war again in the 1930s, as we're preparing for war, they go back into a big battalion, full of Vickers machine guns, 48 this time. And then during the Second World War, that changes a little bit, and we might talk about that later. And then after the Second World War, they go back to the infantry battalions with just 6 in a machine gun platoon. So because fundamentally, one gun on its own, and this is perhaps a fundamental flaw in how people see machine gunnery. But one gun on its own doesn't work very well, because sometimes it will get stoppages, it will break down. So you have pairs of guns working together, and then you have 4 guns working together if it's a big task. And as long as you've got that single building block, you can flex the organization to do whatever task you need it to. You can also, technology does change with the Vickers machine gun. So although the gun stays the same, the ammunition it fires doesn't. So we'll think, well, it's just 303-inch ammunition, and that's what the British had in service until the 1950s, when the self-loading rifle replaces it with 7.62 NATO. But actually, in the 1930s, you have a development from the Mark 7 to the Mark 8Z ammunition, which might sound really tedious and nerdy, but it changes the range of the Vickers machine gun from 2,900 yards to 4,500 yards. So it suddenly goes, well, wait a minute, we can now reach out to nearly 3 miles with the Vickers machine gun. It just changes that capability absolutely massively. So, it's also key that the Vickers, when it goes into service, is horse-drawn. I'm sat in front of a First World War limbered wagon behind me that carries 2 Vickers machine guns as far as it can into action. And in front of that is pack saddlery so that you can put it on horses and you can carry it forward like that. But then before the Second World War, we put Vickers machine guns in small tankettes, the universal carrier. Most people will call it the Bren gun carrier. They're wrong. It wasn't designed for the Bren gun. It was just a universal carrier. It was designed for the Vickers machine gun. Vickers and Carden Lloyd got together and developed this thing. And they put them on those so that they could move independently and in a very, very mechanized manner. Because what you have is this very weighty gun. It's the tripod is 50 pounds. The gun is 40 pounds. Add 7 pints of water and suddenly it's nearly 50 pounds. Each ammunition box is 22 pounds. It feels good talking to an American because I can mention it in pounds and I don't have to convert it in kilograms straight away. But, basically we got 25 kilograms, 30 kilograms and 10 kilograms in how those loads work. It means that you can carry more ammunition forward. You don't have to have all the men that you did. So in the Great War, a machine gun section or detachment was 8 men. You had to have that number. By the time we get to the Second World War, we've got that down to just 3 plus a driver, because you can get this tracked vehicle so much further forward than you can when you've got to lug it, when you've got to carry it. A man can't carry more than 4 ammunition boxes. That's 100 pounds. They can't carry that very far. Normally, they can only carry 2, 50 pounds. So it's really important that the mechanization, actually, the technology around the gun is what makes the gun stay in service. The gun stays exactly the same. There are some tweaks around manufacturing to make it light, not to make it lighter, it actually makes it heavier, but to make it quicker to produce. Because it doesn't matter that it's heavier, because you can produce 10 times as many and you can get something to carry them. So it's often over, we think of this gun as being a Great War design, and in this 1908 to 1912 design that's still in service in the Second World War, and surely it's archaic. But the fact that at the start of the Second World War, and as we go forward in an infantry division in the British Army and in the Empire armies as well, in the Minions and becomes the Commonwealth, it's the most mechanized part of the British Army is a machine gun battalion. They are all in carriers. There are very few trucks. So they're all on tracks, which gives you that cross-country capability. And, at the time, at the start of the Second World War, the British Army is the most mechanized army in the world. By percentage, we're not the biggest. We haven't got the most armored or tracked vehicles, but it's the most mechanized army in the world. So the Vickers is actually the most mechanized element of the most mechanized army in the world. So that's why you can have this heavy water-cooled gun that can reach out to 4,500 yards we carry 4,750 rounds with the gun every time, so 19 boxes of ammunition. That's an hour's worth of firing at the proper rates, not just pressing the trigger and watching it go. So that's why its longevity lasts. That's why I've got a book on the shelf not far from me that is, it's the catalogue of British Army vehicles and hardware. That in it has the Vickers machine gun, but it also has tactical nuclear weapons. And that's because it's in the 1960s. And that's your point about, jets fighting and stuff like that, that just can really sort of blow your mind as how you think machine gunnery develops over the course of a century, really.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's like, and in that answer, like you mentioned so many different things of like, there's like what we might consider like really small changes, like a new type of ammunition that can have massive changes on how you're using how you're using the Vickers when it can fire almost twice as far.
Yeah, but hugely. I mean, you asked me a very simple question and I gave a very long answer.
Yes.
But it's just tiny stuff that, bear in mind though, that those tiny changes, we share the Small Arms Committee minutes and everything as part of some of the archival work that we share online. We share all of that, and that tiny change for ammunition took nearly 20 years to develop. There was lots of people at ICI and Kynoch and all these different ammunition producers, of which there were quite a few. But we come out of the Great War with this huge industry that's set up to make war equipment. What they then do is go, well, we can't make lots of it now because the army isn't having great wars for a while. We have the 10-year rule thing. We're not going to, we're going to get fair warning. So what we need to do is specialize. We need to improve. We need to innovate, and we need to make things better than our competitors. So that's what they spend all this time doing. And by 1938, we have this ammunition that like you say, nearly doubles the range of the weapon that it's going in. And it's worth saying it's not used in the rifle or the light machine guns or anything like that, because what's the point? Because you can't see what you're firing at. So there's no point putting that ammunition in a rifle or a light automatic or a light machine gun, because you can't see what you're firing at that distance.
Okay. I have to ask at this point, and we are zeroing in on this ammunition thing. What did they change to make such an improvement?
Look, I'm gonna look at a bullet now. And I know this is a podcast, so it's really difficult for people, but this is how I explain stuff, and at least Wesley can see it. Mm-hmm. So what you've got, this is a 303 bullet that happens to be on my desk. This was not prepared. It happens to be on my desk, and the back of this is in a slight taper, a slight chamfer. And it's called boat-tailed ammunition. So all they did was put this in that improved the aerodynamics of the bullet so much that it didn't spin. It didn't start to sprawl and tumble in flight. So it meant it could go up higher. So there was less air resistance. It meant it could go further into the air, so that then gravity helps it, and it doesn't start to sprawl and just tumble to the ground so much quicker. So 20 years just working out how much to shave off the back of every bullet. But for anybody that's a shooter, Mark 7 to Mark 8 stuff, will make a difference to it might not make a difference to your rifle. It might not make a difference to your light machine gun, because the bullets aren't going far enough to really worry about it. But if you're firing the Vickers, they make a huge difference.
Fascinating. Tiny little changes like that. But one of the things you also mentioned is kind of on your website online, you have a lot. I really appreciate your website because you have tons of primary sources of various varieties that you've digitized and made sort of public for everybody around all aspects of using the machine gun in the British military. And one of the things that really caught my eye, due to kind of my history in podcasting, with history of the Great War and a history of the Second World War, is a digitization project that you're doing on your Patreon page around digitizing a magazine called 20 Years After. And can you describe a little bit about what these magazines are and where you got them from?
Yeah, so it's worth saying that although we're hosting it on the Patreon page, they are available for everybody to access. We do have a Patreon, and if people want to sign up, great, and they'll get those Small Arms Committee minutes and stuff like that. But the 20 Years After magazines are really hosted there because it's free space, and it gives us an ability to start to play about with how we're sharing those. But what it is it's a sort of then and now magazine that was produced in the 1930s, in the late 1930s, 20 years after the end of the Great War. And they provide articles written by the men that are just 20 years older. So actually, in terms of historical analysis and the historiography of what's there, they're great. They give those first-hand accounts in many cases of different areas from around the Great War. So not just the Western Front, but Salonika, Mesopotamia, Gallipoli, all of these different areas. There's a bit of East Africa stuff in there as well. and naval. There's lots of naval accounts, but there's just 3 or 4 articles per issue. They were distributed on a weekly basis back in the 1930s, and I think there's 120. I might be wrong. It might be 60. I can't remember the size of the stack on my desk. But we're sharing them on a weekly basis. We spotted on Twitter, because Twitter's great for these sorts of things. We spotted somebody offering them free to collect, and we couldn't collect. We were a little bit far away, but I messaged and said, look, if somebody can collect, we'll have them, and I'll scan them and put them online because they look really great. They're also quite usefully, there's a lot of photographs in there. So for people that want to use photographs that are likely to be out of copyright, they're a great source of material. And that's certainly something that, as I mentioned, we publish material. So finding material that's out of copyright for us to either republish or to include in publications is really valuable, particularly when we're working with the constraints of the resources that we have. And so, I think issue 24 went up yesterday, so this is a Wednesday, and went up. They go up every week on a Tuesday, so we're as near to Tuesday as I can make it, but they'll go up every week until we exhaust them. And Martin, the chap that sent these down to us, said free to collector. So it's one of those great sharing stories of social media that is superb. We're indexing them as well, so there's a link on the website. It's a bit hidden because it's on one of our sub pages to a sub page to something about the research that we do, but we've started to catalogue the contents of those as well to try and make them a bit more searchable, because there's so much great archive material out there, but we're so used to just typing something into Google. If it doesn't exist in text form on the internet, people aren't going to find it. So it's really difficult. Keywords and stuff like that we have to match up. But it is one of those many digitization and archive projects that we've spent years doing now.
Fantastic. I used your website to look up something in the Field Service Pocketbook. I believe it was a couple months ago now. And so I was like, I follow this person on Twitter, and here's this excellent resource.
So one of the reasons we did that is because it means that I've always got them to hand. They will sit there. They sit there on the net, and I just, somebody asked me a random question in a field somewhere or in a room, and I'm able to, as long as I can remember roughly which manual it's in, I can go and find that material. So, and it means that all of those, I think we're up to 600 different manuals now in low resolution. And then we're just working through those and re-uploading and re-scanning as necessary in high resolution and putting those onto archive.org. So this is another one of those safeguarding things. So if our website goes down, they're not all hosted into one place. They are there where somebody's got better backup than we have. And they're there and safeguarded, so they will always be accessible. And that's really important, to make sure that we're up to about 250, 300 of those manuals on there now. We are gathering material all the time. There's always something new to acquire as well, which is frustrating and enjoyable at the same time. But we roughly scan in, probably a gigabyte's worth of material a month. Each one of those 20 years afters is 150 meg. So a gigabyte, maybe 2 gig a month, and sharing that online. Now there's constraints in doing that, but hopefully, it makes sure that this primary source material is not only shared, but safeguarded. All of those original source materials now sit in archive storage boxes and don't need somebody to go through to find that stuff. They don't need me when I'm fixing a Vickers to pick up the armourer's manual with my hands covered in grease and stuff like that to look something up. They just need me to get my phone out, get my tablet out, and look it up there, and wipe the tablet off afterwards, hopefully.
Yeah, and I would just say personally, thank you for doing all that work as a person who makes history content on the internet and does not have access to the archives and things that I need. Digitization efforts and people who make stuff available for free online are just pivotal to me doing what I do.
Okay, we may have gone a little barbecue crazy at Sonic. We BBQified not one, but 3 iconic menu items. But I mean, come on, can you really blame us for going slightly overboard? When you add smoked pulled pork and tangy cherrywood smoke sauce to a melty cheeseburger, a brioche-topped barbecue sandwich, and crispy, cheesy tachos, you'd be crazy not to go crazy. Pulled pork barbecue, now at Sonic. Limited time only at participating Sonic drive-ins.
Some of us love history. Others used to or never did because history was presented as nothing but the rote memorization of names, dates, and facts. Basically, the story got left out, and that made history kind of suck. My name is Greg Jackson. I'm a university professor with a PhD in history, and bringing history to life is my passion. That's why I created my podcast, History That Doesn't Suck. I want to teach you everything you need to know about U.S. history, but I do so through stories. Let me tell you about George Washington begging his men not to mutiny against Congress, Clara Barton saving Union soldiers amid enemy fire, enslaved Frederick Douglass risking his life for liberty, and about so many other figures as their real experiences make industrialization, social movements, and even congressional debates and tax policy come to life. Subscribe to History That Doesn't Suck today, and join me, Professor Greg Jackson, every other week for a new episode, where I'd like to tell you a story.
So let's move forward to talk about a new project that you're working on, the Canned Loan Officer project. So what is this book? Sort of how did it come into your possession, and kind of what are you doing with it?
So A Canned Loan Officer was a book written originally in the 1980s by a chap called Rex Fendick. Now, Rex was a lieutenant in the Middlesex Regiment in the Second World War. He is a Canadian. That's the can bit. On loan, that's the loan bit, to the British Army. Basically, as we were getting into 1944, we knew we were going to be invading Northwest Europe. Our officer corps was deplenished, really. It had, it was, many of the officers had been promoted above subaltern rank, so lieutenant or second lieutenant. And that's what we needed. So we basically, the Canadian Army had lots of men at this level. And there was an agreement between the British Army and the Canadians that they would loan subalterns to our infantry. Some artillery guys in there as well, and some Army Ordnance Corps chaps, specialists, but mainly infantry officers that had undergone all of their training in Canada. So it was really low training burden for the British Army. They just went, do you want some ready-trained, ready-baked officers, young officers? And Rex was one of those that had been in the St. John's Fusiliers, which was a Canadian machine gun regiment, set up along the same lines as the British, as I talked about going into the Second World War with these machine gun battalions. So the Middlesex Regiment was one of those regiments that provided machine gun battalions, and Rex went to the 2nd Battalion. It's about his journey as a so his journey from Canada, really, but it hits Normandy shortly after the landings. So the 2nd Battalion Middlesex were the machine gun battalion to the 3rd British Division, Infantry Division, and they landed on D-Day on the 6th of June. They were one of the assault divisions, the 3rd Div. So, and a number of their subalterns were killed. So Rex goes in to as a reinforcement into the 2nd Middlesex, having undertaken a machine gun course in Canada, knowing all this stuff. So he goes in as this ready baked officer. He went back to Canada in 1946 and stayed in the Canadian Army until retirement as a lieutenant colonel. He served in Vietnam, actually. He stayed into that. To sort of that period. So he saw a lot of conflict, and he saw a lot of service. He started to put, but the can loan element is the defining piece of his service that he sort of spoke to me about back in the 90s. He was one of the first one of the first individuals that I spoke to about the Vickers machine gun. outside of my grandfather, as I mentioned, he was the Vickers machine gunner in the Cheshire Regiment, which was the same as the Middlesex. They provided machine gun battalions. But my grandfather served in Italy. So Rex was one of the first people that I ever spoke to that had served in Northwest Europe. And when I say spoke to, I mean quite literally. He lived in Canada. I live here in England, and we spoke on the phone quite regularly, every month or so. And he would tell me tales of the machine gun and stuff like that. And over time, he said that he'd written this manuscript and he was putting it together as a book. He was convinced to do so by two key people. The first was his son, Reg, who I'll probably talk about more in a minute, because Reg has been absolutely essential in this publishing project. And the other was Dolph Goldsmith. And Dolph is an American. Many of you, many sort of firearms guys in the US will know Dolph, because he's written a number of books on the Maxim, called The Devil's Paintbrush, a series of books on the Browning machine guns from his own service in the US Army. And he wrote a book back in the 90s called The Grand Old Lady of No Man's Land, which was about the Vickers machine gun. It was one of the first books that I got. It was a Christmas present from my parents. They must regret it now, surely. But they've been, they've been great supporters in unloading and helping to ship out the second edition of that book, which was published last year. And I was really pleased, like 25 years on from first contacting Dolph, to be a co-author, corresponding author on that book, on the second edition. But Dolph was instrumental in getting Rex to publish his memoirs properly, because it is a fundamental account of a machine gun officer in Northwest Europe. He has written an extensive appendix, which was one of the things he first sent to me. So imagine my sort of glee as a probably 16-year-old at that point, getting asked my view on his appendix on the Vickers machine gun, and how it worked, because it explains everything really well, much better than I can. He doesn't ramble like I probably end up doing. He explains fire control, indirect fire, everything that you would want to know about how to get 4 machine guns working together from a Vickers platoon in various fire control missions and stuff like that. He explains brilliantly. So I've had this book in my possession from buying it from Rex back in 2002, I think. So that's like the third edition of the manuscript he put together. And we published a Great War book 2 years ago now. Or no, we started it 2 years ago. It went out last year on the 33rd Battalion, which was a history and memoir of the Machine Gun Corps. And we've been looking for how do we get... So that was a book that was published in 1919. Very expensive to get original copies now. You're running between £200 and £400 for an original, because it's got beautiful watercolours and everything in it. So we thought, how do we get that story more accessible? Well, let's publish it. So that was out of copyright. And we started to put together this project to publish that. We then completed that and went, wow, that went down really well. What can we do as an association that is here with an object to educate and inform the public in the use of the Vickers machine gun? Let's find some other material. So I looked across my shelves, and the one that had always been at my mind is there's this very, not poorly published, but a true privately published book, is A Can Lone Officer. It's not widely available. There is an ebook version that's been around for a few years, but how do we get this more accessible? How do we get it, like the justice it deserves? There's a few platoon commander accounts that exist. There's infantry ones. So if anybody studies the British Army infantry in Northwest Europe, they will know of Sidney Jarry's 18 platoon, and it's been on the reading lists for officer cadets through the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst for a number of years now. Back to when Sidney Jarry used to turn up and give the talks and stuff himself, and that's great. But it's like that's the infantry, and it is just one account. There aren't many accounts that are like that, and there's certainly no machine gun officer accounts at that level. So it jumped out at me, and I said, well, let me see what I can do to get in touch with Reg, who, Rex's son, because I'd noticed, again, the power of social media, I'd noticed Rex was on Facebook. He'd liked some of the posts that we put on our page. So I thought, oh, okay, I was in touch with Reg shortly after Rex's death, and he passed away a few years ago now. So let me see if I can get that contact going again and ask him. And amazingly, he came back very quickly. Only back in October, I was amazed. I was looking through emails. Did we really start to talk about it? We'd sort of proposed a few things in the month or so before, but back in October, Reg said, well, I'll scan everything for you. I'll rescan it. I've still got all my dad's stuff. I've still got the photos. So because what we've, in the original book are very poor quality because they were published back in early 2002 when photo space mattered. The poor quality. The maps were black and white copies. So he said, I'll rescan it all for you. So what we've been able to do is not only pull together the book and make it more widely available, but really enhance the quality of it and put the full color maps in. We've some really high quality photographs, which are completely unseen. Rex was a guy that carried his own camera, took his own photos, and did what he wanted. Amazing platoon commander. Completely individual. And if you do ever anybody gets the chance to read Sidney Jarry, you'll think, wow, this guy was an individual. And what you start to learn is that every platoon commander was an individual. They did things in their own way, and Rex was just exactly in that mold. So he'd still wear his Canadian battle dress, although he was in the second bit, Middlesex, because he liked standing out. The Canlones wore a Canada shoulder title underneath their regimental shoulder title, but he'd wear his Canadian battle dress because it was a better colour as far as he was concerned. He didn't wear his equipment. He rode a motorbike most of the time. We've got some great photos of motorbike training in Wainwright, Alberta in the book, which weren't in the original because Reg had managed to find some additional photos for us as well. Just some super additions to the book that we're really pleased we've managed to pull together.
Yeah, I was amazed as I was looking through it. We're going to get to the appendix here in just a bit, but I wanted to start on the complete. It's interesting because, let me step back here. The book is it has those super interesting personal stories and personal accounts, but then it's kind of bookended by this appendix with all of this really fascinating information. There were a couple of just very specific examples of some of the sort of personal stories that I really liked. Pretty early on, after he arrives in Normandy, he talks about how he took a motorbike, but it had a different clutch, I believe, than the one he was used to. And so he tells this story of trying to shift while going down a sort of a country road and almost ending up in the ditch multiple times as he's trying to sort things out. I thought that was a very funny story.
Yeah, while following his commanding officer, who's looking back going,
yes,
come on, just keep up. What are you doing? You said you knew how to ride a motorbike, but if anybody's ever ridden sort of European over to the US motorbikes, the clutch and the gear shift are in a different position. So he's going to have to be working that through as he's going along on almost his first day behind his commanding officer. Anybody could just sense the embarrassment of that in front of their new boss.
And then another story was he was discussing sort of dealing with the fact that they were near the front line and they were getting occasionally shelled by mortars. They were in kind of a forested area and it was raining. And he was talking about the problems of do I stay in my slit trench where it's wet and muddy but safe, or do I go sit beside a tree where it's slightly drier but dangerous? And I think the quote he uses near the end of that is, in fact, I did both from time to time, and neither was restful.
Yeah, it's brilliant. I mean, you have to take these accounts with a pinch of salt because they're written. So he started writing this in 1985. Yeah, they're written 40 years after the event, but the richness of his memory and the personal reflections, they sort of jump up. We found some tiny stuff like he gets the name of a canal wrong. Some of the spellings are wrong, which we've added as footnotes. We're not trying to be smart and correct them. We're trying to just say, well, if we found one location, which is really frustrating because he calls it one thing, the British Army maps of the period call it another, and the French have changed the name. So it's so we'll change the spelling. So it's really interesting to sort of get that. So we've just added some little footnotes to try and make it easier for a reader to follow as well. Because what we like to do with our I say, this sounds like we've done dozens of them, but what we would like to do as we go forward, and we did it for the 33rd Battalion. We've started to do it for this. Tom, one of our other directors, is a bit of a mapping guy. So we get on Google Maps and we start to plot all the locations. I say he does. He plots all the locations, and it makes it so that if you want to go and sit at the gun position that Rex had when they were firing on Truon on the X of July, you can. This you just get on your phone, find the maps that we've shared, and you can go and sit at that location, look at what it's now, look at the photos he took from these different positions back then. So we've really tried to do some then and now stuff. So let's say we did that for 33rd Battalion. That worked really nicely. We're doing it for this book as well. Just because, let's say, some of the photos that Rex took, you have seen before, because they're photos he took that then the Middlesex Regiment put in their history, and then others have used it since, which is great, because you go, I know the original source of that. And over time, when they've been photocopied or republished, they've lost their detail. So we've gone right back, with the help from Reg, to the original photo, scanned it in at high res, and that's what we've now got in the book, which is super.
Absolutely fantastic. But we got to talk about that appendix. So you are absolutely correct. Like that appendix of describing how all of this was done I found absolutely fascinating and very readable. Like when you get into that kind of information, I find that often it's not exactly great to sit down with a cup of tea and whatever you're reading and just, have a pleasant time. But I found it felt to me like somebody who had described that information in various forms about 100 times before, and kind of refined maybe how he was describing things and how he was talking about how things were used.
Yeah, I think it's that lived experience, isn't it? He didn't have to check a manual to do that. He even puts that in there. He says, well, I might get some stuff wrong because this is from memory. I've looked back at the manuals for a couple of terms, but this is from memory. And you go, wow, just for a start, wow, because we know that appendix wasn't written until the mid 90s. So that was 50 years on. It's lived experience. He is such a brilliant communicator in that he put that together and was able to, let's say, get those points across. If you try. And trust me, I've tried. If you try and interpret the British Army manuals, whichever style they're written in, because basically machine gunnery doesn't really change from about 1917 onwards. We peak. The Canadians really at Vimy Ridge peak. They teach us everything we need to know, and then it very little changes. So even if you read the 20s manuals, the 30s manuals, the 40s, the 50s, you'd think it'd get simpler, wouldn't you? As people boil this stuff up and rehash it, but it doesn't. You can't work it out. It's not until you sit and read, let's say, somebody's lived experience 50 years on, getting this stuff right, and you go, wow, that's just genius. It's true understanding to be able to explain it to that level of simplicity. And it sort of, it makes me think about what my grandfather knew as well. That's one of the great things here. So the anecdote where people say, what really got you into the Vickers machine gun? Not only did just my grandfather's use of it, but I'd been interested in military stuff for a few years before then. And we went to a military museum, Royal Marines Museum here in the UK, for the 50th anniversary of D-Day. So we know it's June 1994. And my grandfather sat behind a Vickers machine gun, not having touched one for 50 years, maybe 49 years, but certainly a very long time, and took it apart. No hesitation. He knew how to take that gun apart, and he knew how to put it back together. And it's this, that's the simple technical that my grandfather, as a machine gunner, firing the gun, could do. We know Rex could do that because he attended a 1995 shoot here in the UK for the commemoration of the formation of the Machine Gun Corps. Not a unit he was a part of, to be clear, but he was clearly on the grapevine of, if there's an opportunity to fire a Vickers machine gunner, he's going to get in on that. That's the kind of guy that you get from the book once you read it. He'd have leapt on that. And he also does it again in 2002 when there's a commemorative shoot for the disbandment of the Machine Gun Corps, something hopefully we'll get an opportunity to replicate this year as the centenary of that disbandment. But Rex clearly knew how to do that stuff as well. But he also knew how to set four guns up, fire them. Use the resector protractor. Use the director. Use the dial sight. These are pieces of technical equipment that are complicated. The British Army stops training on this stuff for some periods because they just go, it's too complicated. We don't need to train people to do this. And then normally what happens is we have a war where we need to do it. So the Korean War was exactly that. We stopped training people how to do indirect fire in the late 1940s. And the Gloucestershire Regiment, that people may know from the Imjin Hill history, basically write to the small arms school and go, can you teach us how to do map predictive fire? We think it might be useful. Turns out it really was. Same thing happens again in the 70s and 80s in the Falklands, and the Parachute Regiment go, can you just teach us this little bit? We know it's in the old manuals, but with the general purpose machine gun, or the M240 as the US have it, can you just teach us this bit? Because we forget stuff. Well, tell you what, when corporate memory forgets it, there's still somebody with individual memory that can remember how to do it perfectly. And that is Rex's example. His appendix is a brilliant example of that.
I've seen the diagrams for indirect fire. I determined that I did not pay enough attention in geometry class as soon as I started seeing those.
Yeah, when I do talks to school kids or anybody really, actually, you start talking trigonometry and let's say geometry, atmospheric conditions, and you realize, and all of that stuff, map reading, what are actually quite basic skills that we all learn. We all learned machine gunnery when we were about 14 years old. We just didn't realize it. So if the kids are listening out there, learn it, because machine gunnery might come in handy one day. I certainly try and just translate stuff into that that early those early sort of basic trigonometry principles that we learned and forgot so quickly because we thought they were useless.
Well, thank you so much for joining me here today. So, sort of, what is the release date looking like on A Can Loan Officer, and how can people get their hands on it?
So at the moment, we're just putting the final proof together, basically overlaying those high-res images that I talked about onto the proof. We're expecting within the next 6 weeks that we'll be able to open pre-orders for that. We will send around the world. That's one of the things that is making it accessible as possible. We'll have all that on the website. So, and through our social media, it'll probably be around sort of £27 to £30 UK pounds, which we think for 300 pages of absolutely rich history, hopefully people will think that's great value for money and order it as soon as they can, because we'll open it up for pre-orders. That will determine how many go on the print run. These are limited run prints. This is not something we will start doing second editions of or reprints very lightly, because we want to move so quickly onto the next project and start to share more and more history as we go through the year.